My name is Maria Santos, and I'm writing this from a hospital waiting room in San Jose where I'm translating between my 70-year-old father's doctors and my parents who have lived in California for 31 years but never learned English beyond ordering food at McDonald's and saying thank you to strangers, making me their eternal translator, advocate, medical interpreter, legal representative, financial manager, and lifeline to the English-speaking world since I was 6 years old and first became fluent enough to bridge the language barrier that has kept my parents isolated, vulnerable, and completely dependent on their American-born children for every interaction with institutions that control their healthcare, housing, finances, and basic survival. At 35, I've spent nearly 3 decades carrying adult responsibilities that have consumed my education, limited my career, damaged my relationships, and created a role reversal where I parent my parents while they remain perpetual children in a country whose language they cannot speak despite living here longer than I've been alive. The translator burden began almost as soon as I started speaking English fluently in first grade, when my parents realized that their 6-year-old daughter could do what they had struggled with for years, communicate with the English-speaking Americans who controlled access to jobs, housing, healthcare, schools, and every other institution that determined our family's well-being in this country. What should have been a normal childhood developmental milestone, becoming bilingual, transformed into an essential family survival skill that made me indispensable and burdened me with responsibilities no child should carry. The early medical interpretation was the most terrifying because I was translating complex medical information I barely understood, while doctors spoke impatiently to me instead of my parents, treating me as the decision-maker despite being a child who should have had no role in medical conversations. At age 8, I sat in an examination room translating between my mother's gynecologist and my mother, trying to explain symptoms I had no vocabulary for in either English or Tagalog, while the doctor looked annoyed that he had to communicate through a child instead of speaking directly to his adult patient. The school-parent mediation became impossible because I was simultaneously the student and the parent representative in every teacher conference, award ceremony, and disciplinary meeting. When I was struggling in 5th grade math, I had to translate my own poor performance to my disappointed parents while also trying to explain to my teacher why my parents couldn't help with homework, not because they didn't care, but because they couldn't read the English textbooks or understand the American teaching methods that were completely foreign to their Philippine education. The financial interpretation escalated as I became the family member who handled all interactions with banks, landlords, utility companies, and government agencies that required English communication. By age 10, I was on the phone negotiating late rent payments, explaining why our electricity bill was overdue, and trying to sound adult and authoritative enough to be taken seriously despite being a child who should have been playing with friends instead of managing my family's economic survival and preventing eviction or service disconnections. The emergency room trauma was recurring throughout my childhood and adolescence because my parents' work as a home health aide and a custodian meant they had no health insurance and would only seek medical care during emergencies, which required me to accompany them to translate symptoms, medical histories, medication allergies, and treatment options while terrified that any translation error could result in my parents' death. The responsibility was crushing for a child who loved her parents desperately and knew that their lives literally depended on my ability to accurately convey complex medical information I often didn't fully understand. The cancer diagnosis translation at age 13 was the worst medical interpretation I ever had to do, sitting across from an oncologist who told me in clinical English that my mother had stage 3 breast cancer, then having to translate that devastating news to my mother in Tagalog while watching her face crumble and trying not to cry so I could continue translating treatment options, survival statistics, and chemotherapy protocols that would determine whether my mother lived or died. No 13-year-old should have to tell their own mother she has cancer, but I had no choice because I was the only person who could bridge the language barrier between my mother and her doctor. The treatment navigation that followed consumed my entire 8th grade year as I missed school to accompany my mother to chemotherapy appointments, translate instructions about medications and side effects, communicate with insurance companies about coverage, or lack thereof, and serve as medical advocate ensuring my mother received appropriate care despite language barriers that often resulted in limited English patients receiving substandard treatment because medical providers couldn't communicate effectively and didn't have proper interpretation services. The role reversal became complete as I essentially became my parents' parent, making medical decisions about their care, managing their finances, advocating with institutions on their behalf, and protecting them from the English-speaking world that felt hostile and incomprehensible to them. Instead of my parents providing stability and guidance for me during adolescence, I was providing those things for them, creating a fundamental inversion of the parent-child relationship that violated normal developmental patterns and placed enormous psychological burden on me as a teenager trying to navigate my own identity formation while also managing my parents' entire lives. The education sacrifice was significant because my family responsibilities consumed time and energy that should have been devoted to homework, studying, extracurricular activities, and the intensive college preparation that would have been necessary to access the educational opportunities my parents desperately wanted me to pursue. I was an intelligent student with potential for academic achievement, but I was competing with peers whose parents supported their education rather than requiring their children to manage complex adult responsibilities on behalf of the entire family. The social isolation was profound because I could never participate in normal teenage social activities like hanging out after school, attending parties, or going on trips because my parents needed me constantly available to translate phone calls, accompany them to appointments, handle emergencies, and mediate their interactions with the English-speaking world. My friends stopped inviting me to things because I always had to decline, creating loneliness and disconnection from peers who couldn't understand why I couldn't just be a normal teenager when my parents' survival depended on my constant availability. The college guilt was overwhelming when I received admission to UC Berkeley with a partial scholarship that would have allowed me to pursue the education my parents had sacrificed everything to provide, but accepting meant leaving them without their primary translator and advocate in a world they couldn't navigate independently. The decision to attend college felt like abandoning my parents when they needed me most, but staying home to protect them felt like betraying the entire purpose of their immigration and their decades of backbreaking work to provide opportunities for their children. The Berkeley Compromise involved attending college while still serving as my parents' long-distance translator and advocate, spending hours on the phone handling emergencies, making weekend trips home to accompany them to medical appointments and government offices, and carrying constant anxiety about their well-being while I was physically absent from their lives for the first time. The divided attention meant I was never fully present for either my education or my family responsibilities, shortchanging both while trying desperately to fulfill impossible obligations in both spheres. The father's heart attack during my junior year at Berkeley forced me to make a choice between my education and my family's survival. My father collapsed at work and was taken by ambulance to a hospital where staff couldn't communicate with him about his medical history, medications, symptoms, or treatment consent, creating a life-threatening situation that required my immediate presence to serve as medical interpreter. I dropped everything, drove to San Jose, and spent the next month managing his cardiac care, missing classes and falling behind academically while translating between my father and his cardiologist about bypass surgery, recovery protocols, and lifestyle modifications he would need to prevent another heart attack. The employment barriers for my parents were directly related to their language isolation. They remained trapped in low-wage jobs that didn't require English fluency. Home health aide, custodian, food service, despite having work experience and skills that could have qualified them for better opportunities if they could communicate in English. Their economic stagnation meant our family remained working-class poor despite 3 decades in America, and their dependence on me for all English communication meant they couldn't advocate for better wages, working conditions, or opportunities even within their limited employment sectors. The government benefit navigation became my responsibility as my parents aged and qualified for Social Security, Medicare, and other programs designed to support elderly Americans but requiring English literacy to access. I spent countless hours on hold with government agencies, filling out forms, attending eligibility appointments, and advocating for my parents' right to benefits they had earned through decades of tax-paying work but couldn't access independently because all the information, applications, and communications were in English without adequate translation services. The scam vulnerability was constant and terrifying because my parents couldn't identify phone scams, fraudulent notices, or predatory financial schemes that targeted immigrant communities, knowing that language barriers made people vulnerable to exploitation. I had to monitor all their mail and phone calls, screen for fraud, and protect them from criminals who specifically targeted elderly immigrants who couldn't distinguish legitimate communications from scams due to language limitations and unfamiliarity with American systems. The breaking point came when I was 33 years old, had sacrificed a law school opportunity because my parents needed me, was working as a paralegal instead of an attorney because I couldn't commit to 3 years of intensive legal education while managing my parents' lives, and realized that my entire adult life had been consumed by responsibilities I had assumed at age 6 and would carry until my parents died. The accumulated resentment, exhaustion, and grief about my own unrealized potential became overwhelming, and I finally broke down crying in my car after yet another medical appointment where I had translated between my mother and her doctor about her diabetes management. The therapy that began during my crisis was with Dr. Linda Chun, an Asian American psychologist who specialized in treating adult children of immigrants dealing with caregiver burden and intergenerational stress. She helped me understand that my role as eternal translator and parent manager was a form of parentification that had robbed me of normal childhood development, created chronic stress and anxiety, limited my own life opportunities, and generated complicated feelings of love, resentment, guilt, and obligation that were difficult to process or express. Language barrier caregiving for elderly immigrant parents creates unique psychological burdens because it combines all the normal stresses of elder care with the additional complexity of having served as the bridge to the English-speaking world since childhood. Dr. Chin explained during one of our sessions, "You've been parenting your parents for nearly 30 years, since you were 6 years old, and that role reversal has fundamentally shaped your development, your choices, and your identity in ways that are both profound and often unrecognized by people who didn't grow up in immigrant families." She helped me understand that my resentment was valid and didn't mean I didn't love my parents. It meant I was grieving the childhood I lost, the education I couldn't fully pursue, the career I couldn't build, and the personal life I couldn't prioritize because my parents' linguistic isolation made me indispensable to their survival. The guilt I felt about that resentment was also understandable but not necessary, because acknowledging the burden I carried didn't diminish my parents' sacrifices or suggest they had intentionally damaged me by immigrating and failing to learn English. The systemic analysis helped me understand that my individual family's story reflected systematic failures in immigrant integration, English language education, and support services for limited English proficient populations. My parents weren't lazy or unwilling to learn English. They were working-class immigrants with multiple jobs, no access to affordable language classes that fit their work schedules, limited literacy in their native language that made second language acquisition difficult, and social isolation in ethnic enclaves where English wasn't necessary for daily life. The failure wasn't theirs individually, but represented inadequate social support for immigrant integration. The boundary-setting work involved learning to say no to some translation requests, identifying situations where professional interpretation services should be used instead of family members, and asserting my right to my own life and career despite my parents' ongoing needs. Dr. Chen helped me understand that protecting my own well-being wasn't betraying my parents, but ensuring I could continue supporting them sustainably rather than burning out completely from 3 decades of uninterrupted caregiving burden. The professional interpreter advocacy included pushing healthcare providers, government agencies, and other institutions to provide proper interpretation services rather than relying on family members, especially children, to bridge language gaps in situations, requiring trained medical and legal interpreters. I learned that federal law required many institutions to provide interpretation services for limited English patients, but enforcement was weak and many facilities violated those requirements by asking family members to translate instead of paying for professional interpretation. The community organizing work that emerged from my individual experiences includes connecting with other adult children of non-English speaking immigrants through organizations like the National Alliance for Caregiving and immigrant advocacy groups. The collective experiences validated that my story wasn't unique, but reflected systematic patterns affecting millions of immigrant families where American-born children carry translation burdens from early childhood through their parents' elderly years, often sacrificing their own education, careers, and personal lives to serve as eternal interpreters and advocates. The policy advocacy, includes working on legislation to expand access to language classes for working-class immigrants, improve enforcement of interpretation service requirements in healthcare and government settings, and provide support services for immigrant families that reduce the burden on children who are currently serving as family translators. The systemic changes would address root causes rather than just managing symptoms of immigrant linguistic isolation. The Elder Immigrant Services Development includes creating programs specifically designed for elderly immigrants who never learned English, including healthcare navigation assistance, social services in their native languages, and community centers where they can access information and support without requiring their children to translate. The services recognize that elderly immigrants who have lived in America for decades still deserve dignity and independence rather than remaining perpetually dependent on their children for basic needs. The intergenerational healing work involves difficult conversations with my parents about how their language isolation affected me throughout my life. Not to blame them, but to help them understand the burden I carried and the opportunities one sacrificed as their eternal translator. My parents expressed remorse about my childhood being consumed by adult responsibilities and share their own pain about being unable to help me with homework, attend school events where they couldn't understand what was happening, or function independently in the country they had chosen as their home. The mentorship relationships I've developed focus on supporting younger people who are currently serving as translators for their limited English parents and need validation that their burden is real, their sacrifices are significant, and they have the right to set boundaries and pursue their own lives even while loving and supporting their parents. I work to help them avoid the complete self-sacrifice that consumed my own education and career by identifying resources, advocating for professional interpretation services, and asserting their right to age-appropriate roles rather than premature parentification. Today, I continue working as a paralegal while also coordinating with organizations advocating for immigrant integration services, interpretation rights, and support for families dealing with linguistic isolation. The work allows me to use my legal knowledge professionally while also creating systematic change that could prevent other children from experiencing the same decades-long translation burden that defined my life from age 6 onward. The documentary project I'm developing with my parents includes their stories about why they never learned English, the multiple jobs that consumed all their time and energy, the lack of affordable language classes accommodating working-class schedules, the social isolation in ethnic communities where English wasn't necessary, and the shame they felt about their language limitations despite 3 decades in America. Their perspective adds important context about how structural barriers, rather than individual laziness or unwillingness, explain why many working-class immigrants remain linguistically isolated despite living in English-speaking countries for decades. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. Professional therapy with culturally competent providers who understand immigrant family dynamics and caregiver burden helps adult children process the psychological impacts of serving as eternal translators and advocates for their parents. Professional interpretation services in healthcare, legal, and government settings reduce inappropriate reliance on family members, especially children, for translation in situations requiring trained interpreters. Language access advocacy organizations like the National Health Law Program work to enforce legal requirements for interpretation services and challenge institutions that violate language access rights. Community-based organizations provide elder immigrant services in native languages, including healthcare navigation, social services, and support programs that reduce dependency on children for basic needs. Caregiver support networks, including the National Alliance for Caregiving, provide resources and community for people dealing with the unique stresses of caring for limited English proficient family members. Immigration integration programs offering affordable, accessible language classes for working-class immigrants with accommodations for their work schedules and literacy levels. Policy advocacy organizations work on systematic reforms to improve immigrant integration support, expand language access services, and protect children from inappropriate translation burdens. Mental health services specifically addressing parentification and intergenerational caregiving stress provide treatment for the long-term psychological impacts of childhood role reversal. Today, when I meet other immigrant children who are serving as translators for their limited English proficient parents, I tell them that their burden is real and significant, that loving their parents doesn't require sacrificing their entire lives to manage their parents' English language world interactions, and that advocating for professional interpretation services and institutional language access isn't betraying their families but protecting both themselves and their parents by ensuring proper professional support rather than inappropriate reliance on family translation. The eternal translator role damages children's development, limits their opportunities, and creates unsustainable caregiving burdens, and changing that requires both individual boundary setting and systematic advocacy for immigrant integration services that should have been provided decades ago.